Hi and welcome to Echolocation. This is a podcast jointly done by Global Pod in Sweden and K News in Georgia and Diez in Moldova. And we have been, how many issues have we done? Alina, how many issues are we doing? We're not too sure.
That's a question for Levani.
Exactly. But we are getting towards the end, and we want to touch about something which is a little bit the elephant in the room, so to speak, namely the relation between Georgia, Moldova, and Russia. Both Georgia and Moldova has a large Russian population, and since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, we have seen a lot of young Russians go into Georgia to avoid being taken into the military in one way or another. And of course, we have the situation with Georgia. We're going to come back to that later on, that where part of the Georgian territory is still occupied by Russia. So the issue of Russian population, the relation to Russia, is somehow sensitive, I would guess, both in Moldova and Georgia. But what does it feel to be Russian living in exile and also being a person who is against the war? How does you affect when you read about the war, when you follow the war, and the relation with your families, of course? So this is what we're going to discuss in this issue of Echolocation. I have three great people with me. Of course, I have our key persons here in Echolocation. We have Levani Iaganashvili from K News in Georgia. Hi, Levani.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, Alina Gîrneț from Chisinau, as we call the city, in order to remember it. Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, at Diez. And we have our special guest here today, Marina Slashcheva. Is that more or less correctly?
Yeah, that sounds great.
And you are from Russia. You are doing a PhD at the Karolinska University Hospital here in Sweden.
Yeah, that's right.
So you are Swedish also, right, in some way?
Italy.
You're learning some Swedish, so you get into Sweden. So great having you here. And even though, for the listeners of Echolocation, still I think it's good to repeat a little bit about Georgia and Moldova, some people might not know that much about the countries. So let's start a bit with Georgia and Moldova. As some people might not know much about the countries, I think we should talk a little bit about it, give us some background, a little bit focusing also on the relation between the countries and Russia, or rather with what it was Soviet Union, because for those who are young enough, will not have been living in a period when actually existed a country called Soviet Union, where both Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine and a number of other countries actually were part of this large empire. Alina, Moldova, give us Moldova quickly and the relation with the Soviet Union and Russia today.
Well, it's fair to say that our relations with Russia go back to the times when the Russian Empire existed. I mean, it's not starting with the Soviet Union, and it didn't end there. Back then, Moldova wasn't the country that it is today, so quickly, the Moldova today was part of the Romanian Moldova, which is a province in Romania. And then, a lot of wars happened. And one of those wars, the Ottoman Empire lost. And then the gift, let's say, that was given to Russia was almost today's Moldova. So it was called Bessarabia back then. And since then, we can say, somehow the history of our own country began. And then, we all know what happened, First World War and the Second World War, and we were part of Romania again, and it's really twisted and complicated, but then the Soviet Union was created, and the Republic of Moldova that exists now was one of the republics, and then we got the independence in 91, and since then, we are 32 years old, so basically, we can say that our age, the age of my country today, the shape it's today, the borders that it has today, it's only 32 years old. So we are a quite new country, and forming everything, the language, identity, because even the language, we speak Romanian, but still it was kind of affected by all these transitions and periods of time. So now we are fighting a lot inside the country to actually, it was just recently that in our constitution is stipulated that we speak Romanian. It happened last year. So
but you also have a large Russian-speaking population in the country, even though they are Romanian ethnically, or how should you?
Naturally,
maybe it's mixed,
of course,
complicated everything.
Of course, we have Russian-speaking population. Of course, it dates back with the Soviet Union, but I don't think. I mean, it's okay for them to not consider themselves ethnic Romanians. I mean, it's the problem with considering yourself Romanian. It's just delicate for a lot of people. I mean, if you speak from this logical point of view, for example, the fact that my grandparents were born in Romania, in what called Romania, because my country was part of Romania back then. If we consider it like that, then yeah, I have my grandparents were Romanian, so therefore I am Romanian. So based on this logic and on the laws that the Romanian state adopted, I could also get my Romanian citizenship, as well as the 1 million people in Moldova have the Romanian citizenship. So maybe those who decided to do that, maybe they consider themselves Romanian, but I don't think that's the problem right now.
It's complicated, history is complicated. And even though with the language, we're not going to go in deep into that, but your language is also very closely to Italian, for example. It's not like Russian, it's not like Georgian, we're going to go, but it's a Roman language.
Yeah, it's a Latin language, but it has some Slavic influences, but also it has a lot of Turkish influences because, yeah, we've been through all these empires and it's just normal to be like that. But yeah, I mean, it's a process now. We are going through a process where we are trying to understand like our identity. Who are we? Can it be such thing as like only like Moldovans, or they're still nostalgic about Soviet Union, or some people are just, they have this ideal of going back to Romania and it's like quite split the society, but time is passing, let's say, and yeah, we are growing old as a country, and of course some sort of identity appears, and also it's the language problem. So it's quite interesting to live. I mean, I feel like a founder of my own country, like
the country turning into middle age. And if we move to Georgia, your country is as messy as Moldova.
It's not messy.
Not really.
It's just forming.
If you listen to Alina and thought that was complicated, what she said, believe me, what I will tell you right now, it's much more complicated, I think. Because first of all, I would start from, let's say, 1700s, when one of the first kind of geopolitical relationships start to appear between Georgia and Russia. And if we look at our history even before that, due to our geographical location, there was not like 50-year period in Georgia's history from like 5th century that we didn't have either a big army come into our doors or some kind of big war. So Georgia's history has been like full with wars and all of that. But if we compress all the history and start from, let's say, after First World War, when actually Georgia became an independent country in 1918, and unfortunately it only lasted like 2-3 years, because in 1921 Red Army came without invitation, of course, and they like basically occupied whole Georgia. And in 1922, if I remember correctly, we became part of Soviet Union. And after that, for like 70 years, or how many years that is, Georgia was part of Soviet Union. If you listen to the people who actually lived during that times, they say that they were living pretty well, even though they couldn't really like practice religion or have like, of course, independent country. But the people that used to live during that time are still really nostalgic, like generation of my grandfather and the grandmothers. But yeah, slowly, like over the years, they also said that Georgia was kind of like preferential country in Soviet Union because of Stalin, I guess, and they were like living really well. So after that, like 90s started, and of course all the revolution started to appear in the Soviet Union. Georgia was actually one of the first ones to break out of the Union.
But you are the same age as Moldova in that sense.
Yeah, so in 1991 we actually became independent. And yeah, the same age of the countries, but we actually celebrate 100 years of independence in like 3 years ago or 4 years ago, because we count from the first independence. So yeah, our relationship with Russia is pretty complicated because after the Soviet Union, we had like a civil war, which was heavily influenced by Russians. Since we were one of the first ones who broke out, Russia really tried to be harsh with us and like not give a good example out of us, basically. After the civil war, Georgia slowly started to develop, In 2003, we had a revolution when a new pro-European government was elected, and they started to push really hard towards Europe and NATO and all of that. And that was one of the reasons because in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia again. There are, of course, much more things that I can...
But the fact is right now that part of Georgia is still controlled by Russia.
For sure, 20%.
Created two separate republics, Southeast Ossetia and Abkhazia.
Yep.
Yeah. Marina, you got a lot of things about Russia here. I don't know where to start, but how do you look upon Russia during this period? And how is from your perspective, relation with Moldova and Georgia?
So when you say that Georgia is also as messed up as Moldova, maybe I'm like, tell me which country is messed up. So where should I start? I'm even lost. I think people generally now much more familiar with the Russian history, with the history of Soviet Union collapse and what was going on in the modern Russia recently. So I don't want to go into details of history. I think important to mention is that I was born in the modern Russia already, not in Soviet Union. And for me, I also would rather feel that my country, my Russia is a country that is 32 years old, as yours as well. Although this country inherited much, much more from Soviet Union that we would want to expect probably. And generally, the experience of being raised in Russia is also, for me now, quite striking since the school, I think the environment is everything. It teaches you in a specific way that creates some specific image of other countries. And you have to relearn many things later. And things, for example, about war in Georgia in 2008, I was in the 8th grade. This is not something we've been told about in school. Not that it's good or bad, not mentioning this at all. So it was not even on the table. And I would say that my conscious realization of myself as a citizen, as a person, started more or less in 2012. In 2012, in Russia, Putin was re-elected for the 3rd time, which was not entirely legal, and he changed also his duration of his term from 4 years to 6 years. And this is the part where I, for the first time in my life, participated in the protests in St. Petersburg. And in Moscow, at the same time, it was way more severe. And I think we all know how it ended. It ended with some people imprisoned for 6-7 years. And essentially, from 2000 and on, I only can say that the country was mostly spiraling down. Although if I open sources or books, I have a feeling it was spiraling down even before that. But I'm just talking now more about my experience, personal experience. And since 2012, I already realized I want to move because you never know what will happen in the country. You feel that you're very restricted in your freedom of expression. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to become a journalist, and already at this point it was clear that the free, entirely unrestricted journalism doesn't exist in Russia. So I moved away in 2017. In 2014, when I still lived in Russia, the Crimea annexation was another big shock. You were just looking at it and thinking, like, how is it possible? Is it just possible just like that you just occupy part of another country? And when you read about it in a textbook in Georgia, or when you just watch how it's unwrapping in front of your eyes, this is entirely different because you feel like your life seems to be breaking apart, but at the same time, everyone is normal. Everyone is happy. Everyone is like, yeah, nothing happened. We have a bigger country now. So essentially, yes. And then I moved to Sweden in 2020. Since then, I only observe the political events in my country mostly remotely. I cannot say how it feels from inside of the country, but of course, it's like terrifying to watch.
But do you think that people here in Sweden, the Swedish people have been naive, and not only the Swedes, but the Germans and the other European, that we have, this has been what I call it, like a slippery slope, so to speak, but we haven't discussed it, we haven't seen it. I remember going to Moscow and St. Petersburg and other places in the years after 2000, and okay, we knew that it was not a democratic country, but it was many ways, it was open, it was great, this new Moscow booming in restaurant, and going to St. Petersburg was always very nice. Should we have looked much more closer, you think, to what actually happened? Since 2008, we talked about the war. People were laughing a little bit about that war, saying, how come this stupid little country, Georgia, tried to create a war with Russia? Somehow it wasn't taken serious. I don't know, Marina, if you want to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I agree that European nations were probably a little bit naive in this sense, and I think that the checkpoint was actually 2014 when Crimea was annexed, because then there were some sanctions, but with years it became clear to Russian oligarchs and to Russian politicians that they basically were not completely excluded from the European circles. They were still going to Europe, shaking hands. European politicians were coming, and it actually was okay also for the economical situation in the country. But I would say that this is absolutely so, but I don't feel entirely in the position to judge. And another thing that you mentioned, and which also made me a bit to raise these thoughts, that you've mentioned that people went to Russia or to St. Petersburg or Moscow, and all these restaurants all looked good, the country looked prosperous and happy, and everything is nice. I would say that being raised in some other part of the country, which is not St. Petersburg or Moscow, gives you entirely different experience also, and it not as bright.
Levani, your view of Russia, did you know much more than we people in Sweden? You think about what was actually the reality in Russia during that period, or were you as unconscious as we were?
Yeah, since we were really close with all the commotion and geographically and politically, I think really from an early age we all had a hand on the pulse on what's going on. And I think if in 2008, after Georgia's invasion, European politicians, if they had taken seriously what was going on, we probably would not be here today with the Ukraine crisis, right? And I think that after the war, the more than 1 million actually people that were living in Russia, they almost got kicked out. So it was a kind of a really big deal for us at least. But unfortunately, maybe because the media back then was not that global, so there was not a social media present, and it was not a really big news. Also, I remember there was a Olympics going on in China exactly in the August of 2008. So maybe that also played some role, but yeah, we see the result that it wasn't really not that big of a deal for Europe.
And Alina, from your perspective?
I'm not sure it's only about naivete here. International politics is all the time about all kinds of interest, and yeah, I wouldn't like to judge here a lot as well. But I think it's just more than being naive. It's just there are different contexts for different situation, and probably at the time you take some decisions, or you choose to not take some decision just because it's more convenient.
But still, the relation between people in Moldova and Russia, was it a colonial relation? I mean, you touched about a little bit that Moscow was the center of everything, was from Moscow and outwards.
Well, yeah, that was probably for every Soviet country. That's how things happened. At the same time, even if we speak about the Russian language, it was the cool language to speak at the time. We cannot say it was actually mandatory or anything. I mean, from the stories that my dad is telling me, but it was just cool to actually speak it. So, and Russian language was spoken mostly in this elitist circle, let's say. So that's why many technical words were actually learned, and they entered in the Moldovan Romanian language that we were speaking back then. The first time they entered as in a Russian format, And even now they are still spoken like that because people didn't know or didn't try to find an equivalent in Romanian. So only now we are trying to purify, let's say, the language. To give you an example, when you go to the emergency room and you have this, I don't know how it's in English.
Marina, you are the medic.
But even in Russian, how is it? Kapelnica. Yeah. So, for example, that was a word.
So, what is it in English?
I
mean, it's a drug infusion.
It's
when you put it in shallow, infusion shallow.
Yeah. So that was the first time when we started, population, when they started using this word, was kapelnica, and then because they didn't know the equivalent in Romanian, they just literal translation into Romanian. And then it's funny how this is small things, but that's how the things were. And of course it creates kind of an authority, Everything that's Russian was good. They had, the Russians that were brought into Moldova Back then they had all the good positions, and from generation to generation it's somehow still like that. I think 20% of the population in Moldova is are Russian speakers, and I don't know, probably it's still they're in the best circles, still like owning the best businesses and stuff like that. So it's not like it's good or bad, it's just it's how it was like. I don't know. I don't think that the Russian speakers now refer themselves to Russians, or it doesn't mean that they vote for pro-Russian parties, or doesn't mean that they are against Europe. It's not like that at all. It can be the opposite, just that there is this belief, that if you are a Russian speaker, then you must be pro-Putin or against Europe. So, and it's not like that. Things kind of evolved and changed, but I'm just talking about the general attitude and how did it come to that.
Let's get back to that with the culture and identity and language. I mean, when we look into the future, I think that's very interesting. But moving ahead a little bit in the history, when the invasion came of Ukraine, what was your reaction? If I start with you, Marina, you were here in Sweden then. Had you expected it to happen, or were you as shocked as at least many people in Sweden were that we never thought it would happen, actually?
I think I was shocked. Until the very last moment, I still couldn't believe that this happened. We all knew that there are a bunch of tanks and a bunch of soldiers on the borders with Ukraine. And I kind of can very clearly imagine that, because I grew up in the region on the border with Ukraine. My parents still live there. And I knew before the invasion that there are lots of tanks and soldiers there. But I think we just picked up the entire attitude that, this is just to scare people and this is just to push your interests or something else. Looking back, I think I want to say that it was naive to believe that, the war won't happen. But at the same time, for me, it's unrealistic to think that I would literally believe that the war is possible in the 21st century. So I have this very ambiguous attitude. And at the same time, when it happened, I think, looking back, there were all the indications that this will happen.
And how did it affect your relation with friends and family in Russia when the war started? Because you became very much involved in the anti-war movement here in Sweden.
I have still my family in Russia, but I don't have such a wide family or so many friends left there, because first I left my hometown, then I left Russia. And in the end, most of the friends, they either moved from Russia, like for example, all my friends from St. Petersburg, most of them left the country even before the invasion. And the ones that were staying there, they left right after the invasion. So I think I would rather say that my relationship with these people, with both my family and my friends, they became in some sense more emotional and more intimate, because I think this is some shared shock and some shared trauma that we are sharing, and also trying to think together what we could do and what is our place and what is our relation to all of this. So in this sense, I think I learned a lot, and I'm still learning.
And Levani, in Georgia, did you believe in invasion, or were you as shocked as Marina described?
Yeah, I think that in general, personally me and also a lot of Georgians thought that it was really real, the threat of Russians invading, because once you get like a couple of times invaded by one country, you see the pattern, right? And you know that, they first start some kind of training near the border, then they like accumulate more weapons and tanks and all of that, and one sunny day they just invade. And a lot of people actually saw that coming, and it was not a big surprise, especially after the Crimea situation, right? But again, for me and for a lot of Georgians, one thing that came out after the war was that a lot of people left. And after 90s, a lot of Georgians was using Russia as like a way to immigrate and place to make some money and send back to Georgia. And there was like a lot of people doing that. And after the war, most of the people, especially young people, left Russia. And in addition to Georgians coming back, also we got a lot of Russians. So I'm sure we will talk about it later. But in general, we thought that, personally me, I can speak for myself, that I thought that Russia was going to invade, because there were all the signs that pointed to that.
Let's talk about this, the Russian in Georgia, because as you're saying, the Georgians that were in Russia left, but then it came a huge group of Russians to Georgia, and still, I think you can fly now between Tbilisi and Moscow, and the border is open. But that must create an odd feeling for a lot of people. First, the neighboring country invades you, take part of your country, and then a lot of people that country comes to be refuge or at least to stay in your country. Must be a lot of tension, or
there was a lot of discussion around when actually the queues started to accumulate on the border, on the checkpoints. There was a lot of drone shots. I remember that showed like queues of cars coming to Georgia, and there was a lot of debate in political, on a social level also, whether or not Georgia should open the doors for the people. And I think at the end of the day, the people who are trying to run away from something, as a human being, you have to always be mindful of that and open your doors, whoever it is. And especially, I've heard and I've read this, there are some kind of statistics that say that most of the people that are in Georgia from Russia, they don't support actually the war in Ukraine, and they are much more young, more like open-minded people. They are probably also pro-European, but due to the European sanctions, they can't go to Europe. As far as attention, I think people that come in Georgia and the people that came, they were aware of the 2008 situation, so they are much more like reserved. They are not in your face. They try to be, respectful, and that's why we haven't seen like a big conflict between people, because there is some tension, of course. I've felt that in the supermarket when, for example, a seller or merchant didn't want to speak Russian to a person, and he said that I only speak Georgian, and it's like these small things that you see that there's some kind of tension, of course, but since most of the people that came to Georgia are like respectful, I think it's right now in a pretty calm.
Alina, what's your reaction to the war? You remember when it broke out, you were surprised as well?
Yes, we were. We were, because we didn't want to believe that this is going to happen. Yeah, of course, we were watching closely the news, and somehow it was kind of expected, because there were talks like for months, I think, about this, and there were facts already showing that this is going to happen, but still we were surprised. We were surprised for sure. I mean, I remember the first morning, I woke up like normally at 7, or even a bit earlier that morning. I don't remember exactly the time, just that I remember that I woke up and my boyfriend just started working normally, he was kind of offline, doing something offline, and I woke up and I told him, it started, what started? The war started. And we were really shocked, and then people were sharing impressions that's like people that were, because in the first day there were attacks everywhere. So people living close to the border to Ukraine, they could hear some noise, and it was quite scary, and we didn't actually expect it. I'm saying this from my perspective and from my family's perspective, because nobody around me was taking any action or was scared about it, or they were just continuing with their lives. I know people that went to travel to Odessa like 1 week before, it was just, but at the same time I remember that in the beginning of the year I stopped going to Odessa so often, so there was some kind of concern still, but still, yeah. And
for those who doesn't know, Odessa is in Ukraine, and very close to Chisinau.
It's like 1 hour, 2 hours.
That's your beach community, so you're close to
the beach. Yeah, that's where we used to hang out a lot before the war, like going for the weekend. Not only for the beach, but it's an amazing city just to hang out and be there. So
there's a lot of these relations that has changed. Before the war, you can do that, and people were traveling freely, even though we were naive in many ways. Marina, asking you, what does it feel? You're clearly against the war, but do you feel like a pressure? People are expecting you. That your fact that you are from Russia, people will react negatively to you, or how do you handle that in your daily life?
I certainly feel that people might expect me to do something or might expect me to express my position, but I think it's rather my expectation than the expectation of other people. And since it's been like this for 1.5 years, I cannot say that I felt discriminated or something. And I remember in the beginning, in March, right after the invasion, I had to travel to Portugal for a conference, and my mom despite the fact that she was strongly against the war, she was afraid because the news everywhere in Russia were saying that, oh, it's like a terrible Russophobia everywhere in Europe. And she said, oh, be careful, don't speak Russian there. And I was like, come on, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not going to hide where I'm from. But then people in the scientific circle, they cared very little where I'm from. And I think this is the cornerstone that what Russia is so focused about, that everyone around you thinks only about Russia and everyone is against, like actively against. This is not the case. And in many parts of the world, people judge you primarily by your actions and by what you are doing and not by your nationality.
So that means that you can be a normal, in question mark, person doing your normal research without feeling that people question your identity all the time.
I mean, I cannot answer this completely because I still take a very active anti-war stance and I do a lot. So people that know me, they don't judge. But for sure, I mean, for people still living in Russia, you should realize there are some limitations for sure. So there are limitations to do research internationally if you're still affiliated with Russian institutions. But I think it's realistic because it's never done in isolation. Research is not done in isolation. Research, especially in fields like physics or chemistry, is very often done in conjunction with the state and for the profit of the state. So these limitations, they come naturally, and at some point you should admit that if you chose to live in this country and to work for its benefit, you might be affected by what your country is doing. But since I'm not affiliated with Russian institutions at the moment, I cannot say that I experienced any difficulty.
If you look at the culture, then, I mean, we mentioned the language, and you mentioned the expression Russophobia that the Russian regime are using quite a lot. But is it natural that people are against everything that has Russian identity?
I think that it's natural that people start questioning these things because they naturally try to think what led to this. And one obvious answer is yes, that it was buried in history and literature and so on. For me personally, it's most important to focus on the fact that Russian culture is actually not uniform at all. Something that we call Russian culture is like this thing that was actively promoted in the Soviet Union to all the different parts of Soviet state, but also still Russia is very big and consists of lots of different ethnicities and lots of different republics. And Russian culture, what is usually how it's called Russian culture, is something that is usually like pushed upon these people. And I think it's very naturally to question why it was pushed to all these people and why it was promoting obviously like imperialistic values to the people that were occupied by Russia and whose cultures were basically erased and the language suppressed and so on. And another perspective could be that maybe people would try to look more closely at the culture of different ethnicities within Russia and in different republics and rather try to promote, let's say, the native or intrinsic cultures of the other folks within Russia as well. I think that would be more productive and more useful actually than just cancelling what is traditionally called Russian culture.
Levani, Georgia has a strong culture, strong identity. If we travel to Georgia, people tell you that they are the best, the most important, the best writers, the best wine, etc., etc. How do you look upon the Russian culture? Are you able to read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, or are you feeling that never again?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the generation that you are born in. For me, as a 90s kid, we were strongly influenced by Russian culture for sure, because first of all, in general, the educational system is still even today I don't know how to say it, but beneficiary or like a child system of the Soviet system that was in place. So especially for me in the 90s, every movie that you wanted to watch was in Russian, I mean international ones, and also like in school.
I mean, even if you saw Spider-Man, it was
for sure everything was Russian, and that's why like from my generation at least, almost everyone can speak Russian really well. But over the years, as I already mentioned, after 2003, since the government was more pro-European, they started to change that. And there was actually a point in Georgia when in the restaurants or bars, you couldn't play Russian music because it was banned. You could get fined for that. It was after the war in 2008. Right now, that's of course changed because currently our geopolitical situation is much more different, let's say. But as far as cultural and reading books, for example, in Russian. Of course, one of the first books that you also read was Tolstoy and all of that. So I think still today the influence is really high, especially in the older generations, but not that much in the young generations. I would really want to add, because since after 2003 a lot of things changed, and they are much more dependent on the, let's say, like Western culture than Russian.
Alina, from your perspective, do you read Russian classic literature, for example, or listen to Shostakovich?
Yeah, I read Russian literature, and I'm planning to read more. I don't know. I will agree with Marina here, because it's really important on how you look at things and how you use, these means, and how you use the different kind of resources, and what's the purpose, what's the final purpose. And you can use the language or the culture as a means to do something, or you can use it as a weapon. So then the intention is the one that is actually at fault here, not exactly the means. For example, when we were when the first shape of what's today called Moldova, like the Bessarabia that I was telling you earlier, and when Bessarabia, that province, was absorbed into the Russian Empire, I know that Russian language became, of course, mandatory, but actually this didn't really affect the Romanian language, because at the time, because it was spoken only by people that knew to read, and there were not so many. So the others that couldn't read and they were not part of these elitist clubs and circles, then the peasants, they kept the language very well, and they preserved it.
There's no point getting into what will happen with the war. It's still going on. We don't know the end. But it will come to some kind of end someday, and most likely Europe will not be the same. But how could a relation be constructed the scenario might be that completely defeated Russia, or it could be an ongoing war, or it could be a situation where a change of power in Russia, negotiated change. But how could we build a new relations between and create a new trust between countries and between people? Well, if I ask you, Marina, what do you see in the long run?
For sure, for many young people abroad, and for many people that left the country after the full-scale invasion, the first condition that they would be ready to come back is obviously that Putin and the whole regime he created is completely out. Another fear that most Russians now have is that it will be replaced by something that is either worse or the same, or maybe slightly better, but basically doesn't change the situation drastically. And then people are also afraid that it might be similar to something like Germany after First World War, the country that was humiliated, and the country that has a very strong feeling that they have to raise and come back and everything. And this most likely the chances of this will be increased if the country will be in a very poor economical situation, which again will very likely happen. Thinking for the future, I think one thing that is absolutely crucial and necessary is, of course, education and building some horizontal connections within the society. And the thing that I learned here in Sweden from the experience of building organization and working with other people, that I think that many small-scale interactions and many small-scale horizontal relationship between people in work, in any field of the activity in the society, it makes society definitely more resilient and sustainable, and prevents something that can happen, like in the case with the war. And definitely, I think people that will come back and will build this society from the bottom up, they will be very much needed. And I feel like I would say exactly the same about the relationship with other countries, and eventually also with Ukraine, because at some point we are still neighbors. There should be people that will need to talk in the end, even about things like reparation and rebuilding Ukraine. Someone will have to talk about it. And I think it's good to try to keep the relationship we already have across countries and across borders, and try to sustain them and try to develop them in the future as well. Because from my experience, I think it's crucial to have interactions between people, not on the high political level, but just in the society, in any form of organization, doing cultural work, educational work, sports, whatever. And of course, science, who knows? I cannot completely exclude the scenario where I would go back and try to do good science or educate people back in Russia.
You mentioned Germany after the First World War, but rather Germany after the Second World War, that you needed total dismantling of the institution. It's more like that you see actually as a necessity for the continuation.
So I'm not an expert in this field, and what I've heard is some people saying that this is rather impossible in Russia because Germany was occupied completely after the Second World War, and Russia will not be occupied just for a simple reason that it's huge. And no one knows if it's really possible to do this work without occupation and without force, just basically by, let's say, soft power of education and trying to build communities and civil society. But we will see. Of course, we hope so, because for sure there are people that want to do it.
Levani, from your point, how do you see the future relation? I mean, we have the two territories, as you mentioned, that are still occupied. That needs to be solved, I guess. Otherwise, there will never be a full relation, or?
Yeah, I would say totally. Without solving the two issues in terms of occupied territories, it would be really, really hard to mend all the difficulties that exist. But even though that's still today, that is not resolved, between the people, I can see and I can feel that there's still a big connection, right? Because everyone has some relative or everyone has someone who was either Russian, who is now Russian, or like this region around Russia, and especially Caucasus, is really interconnected with each other. So even though Russia did like some terrible things, still today there are people that don't really blame people for that, but actually blame the government. We try to distinguish that as much as possible, because there are some cases when you can't really distinguish that. For example, we were talking about Germany, right, and the Nazism regime. But it's hard to distinguish people from the government when you see that most of the people, for example, are not standing up against them. And you can say that same for Georgia, for example, because there are a lot of people who don't like government, but still no one's doing anything, right? So I would say that it's a really complicated topic, but at the end of the day, people are on a human level, everything can be mended. But if for that to happen, we for sure first need to talk about all the territories that are being occupied right now.
Alina, Moldova is also on the track to becoming EU member. What do you look upon the relation? Will be a distancing fully more complete against Russia, or what will you see in the long run?
Yeah, it depends of course, on how things will evolve politically there, but there will be, of course, relations, because basically the same reasons that Levani was mentioning, that people have relatives there. I mean, and there were, actually, I didn't mention that, but there's a lot of Moldovans that went a long time ago to work in Russia, and they moved there. I have relatives there that live there, so everyone has somebody that is in Russia now. Either it's temporarily just for some seasonal job, or it's for already going for many years. So that's a thing, and the Russian-speaking minority won't go anywhere. Actually, they are the ones that stay more in the country. The Romanian speakers are going abroad, and the Russian speakers are staying. Yeah, and that's something that it will define somehow the relations, and they will be. And the economic relations we still have. We are still buying things from Russia now. And I'm not speaking only about gas. I mean, we are continuously having this trade relations, so that this will continue for sure in a way or another. And well, about our European path, I don't think that can somehow... I mean, of course, it depends on how the things will end in Russia. But I don't think that these two paths... I mean, they can be somehow connected in a way that they don't harm it. I think in the long run we can see a future where this works perfectly on both sides without having to choose,
Still, the cultural relations will be able to continue developing. Is that correct, Marina? Interpretation also what you're thinking?
I think so. I agree. One thing that I was also thinking when you mentioned about like a bunch of Russians coming to Georgia, I think one thing Russian people, young people have to learn is to be more humble and to kind of get rid of this attitude that they learned, this slightly imperialistic flavor that was very, very popular in Soviet Union, treating different republics and different ethnicities that, now we will come here and we will teach you how to do things properly. And it's still seen, like, for example, it's known that in Soviet Union, many people like Tatars or Burats, they were treated like barbaric. And Russia was trying to impose this high culture on them, high traditions and everything. I think people have to learn that this is not the proper attitude. They have to unlearn it, because this is not something that they do out of evil. Obviously, they do it just because this is the way how they were raised and how they were educated. So I think we learn to get rid of this attitude, and then I think the cultural and political productive exchange is totally possible.
Yeah.
Levani, you agree? Or?
Yeah, I totally agree 100%, because from my point of view, like in 2008, I really remember the Su-25s flying over my head, not knowing like will they drop the bomb or not. So after you like live through that, you don't want to get like a random Russian person like looking over you or like saying things that you might get upset. So if I totally agree with you, and I'm really happy that most of the people that are currently from Russia and Georgia, they somehow know that, and they have their own space, and they don't try to agitate anyone. And I think that I hope that it will stay that way, because on a human level, I really respect everyone, but you should also respect others. So I totally agree.
Alina, you're also the optimist in this, or you have a contrary position?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, the relations will exist. Anyhow, there will be some relations. I mean, we don't know now that it will be for the good or it will be for the bad, but still there will be some connections, because you cannot just cut things. Obviously now during the war, and we still have some connections. I mean, people going to Georgia, a lot of people going to Georgia, and even, I don't know, you had like, when we were in Georgia last time, you had some protests, like big protests, and I know for sure part of the protesters were young Russians. So it's like the connections will exist in anyhow, but for sure it's about changing the attitude, but this will probably come once things will change and will evolve in some way. By that I mean like how the war will end.
Great to be able to continue and to conclude such a discussion in a positive manner, I would say, that we are, because when we talk about Ukraine, we talk about the war, I mean, everything is so dark and gray, but here, I mean, I'm happy to hear that in the long run you are positive, and also, I mean, we talk about generation. You are more or less the same age as your countries. That means we have another 20, 30, 40 years to go, and hopefully things could become much better than what we see today, even though it's our dark times here in Europe. So I'd like to thank you so much for taking part in the discussion. Our special guest here, Marina Slashcheva, who is from Russia and is doing a PhD study here in Sweden, and also very active in the organization Russians Against the War. And of course our co-workers in the co-project Echolocation, Alina Gîrneț from Moldova and Levani Iaganashvili from Georgia. And my name is David Isaksson, and thank you so much for listening to us, and keep on listening to our other episodes. Thanks a lot, and keep on listening.